Hi, everyone. It's Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario. We are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Moreh Nevukhim. We are using the Shlomo Pines edition, which is considered to be, by most, the best to date translation directly from Arabic into English. And we are currently in section 2, chapter 36. You can find it in the Shlomo Pines edition on page 369. And what we've been discussing up until now is the Rambam's thesis on prophecy. Now, I want to refer your attention back to chapter 32, just for a moment. In chapter 32, which was on page 360 and 361, the Rambam had told us that there are three opinions about what the prophetic experience is all about. The Rambam said that the first opinion, which he ascribes to the multitude of those among the pagans and believed by some of the common people professing our Torah. So the Rambam many times will do that, is that he'll say that there are some people who are provincial among us Jews, and believe in a provincial way about how prophecy works. And he said that basically God chooses whoever he pleases, whether that person is wise or ignorant, but as long as that person is righteous and deserving of an encounter with God, God will allow that person to achieve prophecy. The second opinion is that of the philosophers, that prophecy needs to be achieved after a person goes through a period of training to develop their intellect and to develop wisdom and to understand about everything that exists in all of reality in order to be able to have an intellectual priming so that he can receive this divine intellect that is coming to him from God. Once a person does that and they have the proper God-given talents to be able to prophesy, so then they will automatically achieve prophecy. And then he said the third opinion was that of our tradition, which is almost identical to that of the second opinion, that of the philosophers. The only difference being is that according to our tradition, no matter how much a person may properly prepare themselves, it is ultimately up to God to decide whether a person shall be privy to prophecy or not. So that wasn't such a long ago chapter. If I would encourage you to go back and listen to that chapter, or review that chapter 32. The Rambam is really continuing that discussion in chapter 36. What does become apparent both from chapter 32 and chapter 36, which we'll look at today, is that the Rambam's approach to prophecy is an Aristotelian one. That is, the Rambam views the prophetic experience as the ultimate intellectual experience. It is the product of a developed mind that is constantly striving to attain more and more higher levels of wisdom until it conjoins with an external source of wisdom that sort of gives it a lightning bolt of inspirational intellect. Now, if you recall, the Rambam had talked about before something called the Seichel HaPoel, the Fa'al el-Akal, or Akal el-Fa'il in Arabic, and the active intellect in English. This is an entity that is described in some post-Aristotelian followers of Aristotelianism that talk about this idea of there being some disembodied entity that is part of the celestial realm that God created as an intermediary to be able to allow human beings to connect to divine knowledge. It's almost like we talk about that eureka moment that a person achieves when all of a sudden they feel that they've been imbued with some kind of epiphany. According to the ancient philosophers, the followers of Aristotle, this is not due to some internal machinations of the mind, but once a person works hard enough, and it's called in Aristotelian writings, which the Rambam quotes, converting your potential intellect into actual intellect, meaning that you've done everything that you need to do in order to attune the mind to receiving divine wisdom, then at some point your mind conjoins with that external source of wisdom, known as the active intellect, which channels down divine wisdom into the individual. That is how Aristotle, or at least some of his interpreters, understood what inspiration is. But the Rambam transforms that into a definitional working meaning of what prophecy is. And so the Rambam really is using philosophical terminology to define prophecy. So I want to sort of give you the punchline of this, or sort of the bottom line of this chapter, by sharing with you a screen that will have the outline of today's shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, today's presentation. But really, the first sort of the bottom line, which is the Rambam doesn't really get to until page 372, towards the end of our chapter, is that there are really three prerequisites to prophecy. He had begun that discussion in chapter 32, but really crystallizes it in our chapter. The Rambam says that number one, a person needs the perfection of the rational faculty. The Rambam is borrowing from Aristotelian writings that describes the mind as containing different faculties. There's a rational faculty, the faculty that is in charge of generating ideas based upon logic. So that's what we call the rational faculty. It's the part of our mind that performs mathematical equations. It's the part of our mind that makes inferences and logical conclusions. But it's sort of like the robotic or the mechanistic part of our mind that works not based upon fanciful imaginings, but rather on logic. So the rational faculty needs to be developed through study. Now, if we look at the language of the Rambam, it appears that the Rambam believes that this part of our mind is not attached to the physical body at all, and as such can be perfected by anyone possessing any modicum of a working faculty of being able to make such equations and calculuses in their mind. That's the first prerequisite, is that it takes work. A person has to work on perfecting their rational faculty by trying to gain as much wisdom as possible of all reality, of all that exists, both in the sublunary realm and in the celestial realm. The second thing that a person needs is the perfection of the imaginative faculty through what the Rambam calls natural disposition. This is a classic dichotomy that the Rambam is creating between nature versus nurture. The rational faculty needs to be nurtured to the point where it achieves excellent intellect. The imagination faculty, or the imaginative faculty, is a different part of one's mind, which the Rambam seems to be saying is connected to one's physical makeup. And that is why it depends on one's nature. The Rambam emphasizes again and again in this chapter that just because a person wishes to achieve prophetic excellence does not mean that they will be able to. And the simple reason is that you have to be born with, congenitally, you have to be born with an excellent physical endowment within your brain to be able to imagine things properly. Now, the imaginative faculty, as the Rambam will point out to us, is in charge of receiving ideas from the rational faculty and forming those ideas into images that one conjures in one's mind, either in a sleeping state or in a waking state. But the point is that if a person lacks imagination, then they will not be able to achieve prophecy, because prophecy for everyone except for Moses is the receiving of communication through illustration, through images in one's mind. And the third thing that a person needs is the perfection of moral habit through the turning away of thought from all bodily pleasures and the putting an end to the desire for the various kinds of ignorant and evil glorification. The Rambam means two things here. The only way to achieve moral behavior and moral pursuits is, number one, putting aside any sensual desires or lusts that you have, and number two, putting aside the desire to associate and lord over, to be a leader of men. Because invariably when a wise person wishes to be a leader of men, that will draw the wisdom out of the person, that will pull the person down, because through associating with unwise people, they will distract you through their prattle, through their meaningless conversation and their distracting conversation, and that will pull you away from ultimate wisdom. I know that it sounds quite elitist in the way the Rambam is describing prophecy, but remember, he views this as an intellectual endeavor among a certain class of elite people who, both through their own efforts and through their naturally born talents, are able to receive this kind of prophetic experience. So now that we've given you sort of an opening of really what the whole purpose of this chapter is, which is to describe, according to the Rambam, how prophecy works, let's look at a brief outline, and then I want to point out something important at the end of the chapter. So you could really divide this chapter into two parts. We'll call them Part A and Part B. Part A is where the Rambam sort of gives us an introduction to the whole concept of how the mind works, how the mind receives images. So he says prophecy is an overflow from God via the active intellect, as we've explained. It first travels to the rational faculty and then to the imagination faculty. So first, a person, because they've perfected their rational faculty, that part of their mind can conjoin with the active intellect, receive those epiphanies that are endowed to the individual from an external source, that contain divine information which God wants the individual to receive, and then that spills over and overflows to create images in the imagination faculty. Now, the Rambam writes that this does not exist in all people. First of all, he says one must possess the congenital nature of a healthy physical imagination faculty, which is part of the Rambam's brain. He says that you're born with the brain. The brain is part of your physical body. Within that brain contains your imagination faculty, and therefore, if it's healthy, you're good. If you're not, if you weren't endowed with all of the ingredients necessary for a healthy imagination, then no matter how much you'd like to be a prophet, you will never achieve it. If one's imagination faculty is defective, then no degree of effort will help to achieve prophecy. Next, the imagination is the seat of prophecy, because this faculty of your imagination does three things. A, it retains things perceived by the senses. B, it combines perceived things in the mind. What that means is that a person can see a bird flying, a person can see a horse galloping, and then through their imagination faculty, they can create a Pegasus, a flying horse, even though one doesn't really exist. But that's what the imagination faculty can do. It can take images that I've received with my senses and combine them to create something fanciful that doesn't exist in the real world. And then the third thing that the imagination faculty does is that it imitates. That's the language that the Rambam uses, i.e., it conjures up memories of those images long after they've been perceived. So when I use my memory faculty in combination with my imagination faculty, I can conjure images in my mind of things that I may have seen years ago and that are not really there in front of me. One's imagination faculty works best only when the senses rest and do not perform their actions. Now, this is an important idea that the Rambam develops, and it is in accord with what he has taught us before, that usually when a prophet prophesies, and we talked about last week, we talked about the difference between the prophecy of Moses versus the prophecy of other prophets. Other prophets have to have their sensory perceivers, their senses turned off in order to have this overflow experience into their imagination. Because the imagination faculty works best when the senses are at rest and are not drawing in new information from a sensory source. This is when the aforementioned overflow occurs and is the cause of communication in dreams, where dreams can sometimes contain prophetic knowledge. Prophecy is merely a greater degree of clarity of information than being in a dreamlike state. But the Rambam says it's only a question of degrees. A dream can be somewhat of a prophecy if it's coming from a divine source. It's not a prophecy because it's only very fuzzy images where the message is not clear. But as we'll see, a prophetic message is crystal clear without ambiguity. And this is why our sages say that chalom echad mishishim linevuah, that a dream is 1/60th of prophecy, meaning that there's some similarity, some pale similarity between a dream and a prophecy. They also say that that Rabbi Hanania Bar Yitzchak used to say that there are shalosh novlotein. There are three things that are compared to fallen fruit, fruit that falls off the tree before it has a chance to ripen. And the three things are that novlot mitashena, that a sort of a semblance, and that's what we mean by novlot, by fallen fruit. It's a semblance of the ripe fruit, but it's not there yet. Is that a semblance of death is sleep, a semblance of prophecy is a dream, and a semblance of olam haba, the world to come, is the Sabbath, is Shabbat. Now, the Rambam writes, the analogy to unripe fruit is an apt analogy, since a dream could have developed into a full-fledged prophecy. It could have ripened into a full-fledged prophecy had the person been more prepared to receive that prophetic experience through the development of their rational faculty. And then he writes that scripture, not only our sages attest to this idea that dreams are a semblance of prophecy, but scripture also attests to the similarity between dreams and prophecy, as it says in the book of Numbers that when God was rebuking Aaron and Miriam over their lashon hara, over their gossip about their brother Moshe and their criticism of him, because they felt that he was acting on the fact that he was a prophet, and they said, we're prophets as well, and we don't have to behave in the way that Moses is behaving, so why is he doing it? But what God had to point out to them, that Moses' prophecy was unique. And in the course of explaining how Moses' prophecy was unique, God explained to them what a regular prophecy is in contrast to a Mosaic prophecy. And he said, Im achem, that when it comes to your normal prophets of God, then God will b'mar'a elav et vada, will appear to that person in a vision, b'chalom adaber bo. God will appear to that person in a dream. And the Rambam says, we see from here that the word chalom, together with the word mar'eh, the word dream, and the word vision, are both associated with prophecy. And the Rambam then says, so now that we've pointed out that a dream is a semblance of a prophecy, what does the word mar'eh, the vision, mean in that verse? The word vision comes from the word sight. So what kind of sight does a prophet have when he receives an image into their mind? It's really a borrowed term. It's sort of to imply that the vision or the image that is conjured in the prophet's mind is so clear that it's as if he's looking at something externally in the physical realm when that's not really the case. And that goes back to what we learned a couple of weeks ago when the Rambam talked about how the vision that Avraham Avinu had of the three angels visiting him never really was in the external world. It was a vision that Avraham had because he was having a prophetic experience. And it appeared to him as if they were in a physical external reality, when in reality it was a prophetic image that was planted in his brain. Each prophet's degree of strength in their imagination faculty is unique to that prophet, and therefore you will find that no two prophets share exactly the same level or sort of image. No two prophets receive the exact same image of prophecy. The imagination faculty also conjures images of what a person thinks about during the day, says the Rambam. And so this is sort of to reinforce the idea that the imagination faculty is the part of my mind that creates images. Sometimes those images are overflowed from a divine source, and sometimes they are constructed by my own psychology when I think about things or I obsess about ideas or people or places that I think about during the day. So therefore, our sages tell us also that a person will only dream about things that he saw during the day, such that the imagination faculty is always receiving an overflow from the intellect, whether it's from a divine source or whether these are man-made images because of certain obsessions over the course of the day. Now, this part A was really just an explanation of how the imagination faculty works, how it's capable of receiving images as an overflow from a divine source, or how it can receive images based on a person's rational thought that is generated from within. Part B is where the Rambam says, so after I've given you this introduction, it becomes clear that a person needs to be born with a healthy body, which includes a healthy brain, in order to be able to have a healthy imagination faculty, which, as we mentioned, is part of the physical part of an individual, which is why every person will be unique in to what degree of perfection their imagination faculty is. Such a person will then hone their intellect, which is, it seems that the Rambam is saying that the intellect is a part of your mind that you can develop independent of your physical health, right? Every person who at least can make certain calculuses and work with logic has the ability to hone and develop their wisdom. And then if they're endowed with a healthy imagination faculty in their body, those two things together, being born with a good imagination faculty, working very hard to develop your intellect, will bring to a person to a study of wisdom. While obtaining his wisdom, his intellect transforms from potentiality to actuality. We mentioned that at the outset. And he also gradually develops pure and well-tempered human moral habits that, as a result of studying wisdom and trying to understand the world around him, invariably a person starts to be affected by with the realization of the trivialities of other things that exist in this world, including immoral behavior, because a person, as he becomes wiser, also starts to realize the folly of departing from a moral path. And just to quote the Rambam, then all his desires will be directed to acquiring the science of the secrets of what exists and knowledge of its causes. Such a person will have detached his thoughts from bestial matters, which involve primarily the sense of touch, namely sexuality, food, and drink, anything that I touch in order to gratify myself. Well, once a person has obtained a certain level of wisdom, he will realize that this is not moral, and he will eschew those kinds of pursuits. The other senses, such as smell, hearing, seeing, can sometimes involve human pleasures, which aren't always negative. And here the Rambam draws a distinction between bestial pleasure, the types of lusts and desires that we share with members of the animal kingdom, and human pleasures, such as the intake of aesthetically pleasing things, which are not shared with the animal kingdom. An animal doesn't sit down and watch a sunset and just feel that sense of a calmness and tranquility, right? The way that a human being does. Now, here the Rambam is invoking something which he also talks about in his introduction to Pirkei Avot, known as the Shmona Prakim. In the 5th chapter of the Shmona Prakim, the Rambam also talks about the importance of trying to train oneself to morality, to rejecting sensual pleasures, but at the same time he acknowledges that there can be benefit to certain sensory pleasures that are not involving the sense of touch, but rather the more ethereal kinds of sensory pleasures, such as smelling, hearing, and seeing. So he writes there in his Perush HaMishnah, he writes, Omnam hanachon shiyasim tachlit kol hanahagotav briut gufo vehemshech mitziuto lashleimut. You want to make sure that you take care of your body. You want to make sure that you try and perfect yourself as much as possible. Kidei sheyisharu klei kochot hanefesh, so that by having a healthy body, all of the faculties of your soul, asher hem evarei haguf shleimim, that in other words, all of your limbs, all of your bodily limbs should remain whole. V'tit asek nafsho mibeli monea b'ma'alot hamidot v'ma'alot hasichliot. This will in turn enable your spiritual faculties to work unfettered towards achieving their goal, to achieve morality, and to achieve intellectual perfection. And then the Rambam writes a couple of paragraphs down, V'chasher yasim ha'adam kavanato mi'inyan zeh, gitbatel mi'pu'ulotav v'yechsar midiburav harbei ma'od. When a person focuses on that path, much of his physical activity and much of his conversations will become curtailed and minimized. Kimi she'idbak bezota kavana lo yit'orer lefateach haketalim bazahav. Someone who is attaching himself to that path in life of morality and intellectual perfection is not going to be interested in adorning the walls of his house with expensive accoutrements like engraving gold on the walls of his house. Ola asot rikum zahav babeged, or to make gold embroidery in a garment. Ela imkain yechavein bazel laharchiv nafsho. But then he provides a caveat and he says, unless the person's objective is to expand their soul, kedesha tavri, so that your soul should have a healthy disposition. V'yigorash chulya mimena ad shetihiyeh bihira v'zakal lekabel hachochmot. Sometimes you may want to surround yourself with aesthetically pleasing items so that you will have a greater sense of mental health, is essentially what the Rambam is saying. And then he quotes our sages in the Talmud who say, Dirana'a v'ishana'a umita mutzaat l'talmidei chachamim, that a beautiful abode, a beautiful wife, and a nicely made bed provides respite and provides pleasure to a Torah scholar and will give him a certain breadth of thought when he sees aesthetically pleasing things in a nice abode and having an attractive wife. All of those things will enhance his ability to think clearly. And therefore, the Rambam says that there is a place for aesthetics to enable a person to gain greater intellectual and moral perfection, provided that a person curbs their appetite for the sensual kinds of pleasures other than the more ethereal ones having to do with sight and smell and hearing. So, but not the sense of touch. So the Rambam says, now, why do I need to point this out? Why do I need to point out how to obtain moral virtues in a chapter about prophecy? He says we needed to mention this, even though we've gone a little bit off topic, because there are many men who have perfected their intellects and have superior imaginations, yet still do not achieve prophecy. So why is that? It's because they are indulgent in either sensual pursuits. In other words, they have worked on becoming intellectual scholars, but they have not yet been prepared to reject the pleasures of the flesh, is essentially what the Rambam is saying. And if you're not prepared to do that, then no matter how wise you are, you will never achieve the prophetic experience. And then reason number two, that some people work hard on their intellect but still do not achieve prophecy, is because of the pursuit of leadership and honor. And the Rambam writes that this social association with others over whom he wishes to rule will only draw him away from his ability to prophesy, as we mentioned at the outset of this chapter. And therefore, I quote, he should rather regard all people according to their various states, with respect to which they are undoubtedly either like behemoths or chayas. That, in other words, the Rambam says that, and this is a very elitist statement, that if a person really wishes to obtain intellectual and moral perfection, you have to look at your peers within society as animals. That they are, it's like associating with them is associating with the horses in the stable or the cows in the barn. And the reason why that's important, says the Rambam, is not because you should have this condescending attitude for the sake of condescension or for the sake of arrogance. No, that's not at all the issue. The issue is that what can I do to incentivize myself, to detach myself from my social circle? The only way that I'm going to be able to attain absolute intellectual perfection is by not going to the cocktail party and mingling and talking about politics and the news and different people and various other things which are quite trivial and which are going to pull me away from being able to conjoin my intellect with God's. The only times that a perfect man of solitude thinks of others at all is either when he feels that he needs to sort of differentiate himself, to save himself from harm when thinking how they can harm him, meaning that I have to remind myself, I don't want to be like those people. I want to be able to work on myself so that I can transcend the rat race that my peers find themselves in. That's the one time then you'll think about others. or when a person realizes that he needs something from them. So he'll have to go to the grocery store once in a while and pick up groceries and then go back up to the mountain where he's a hermit so that he can commune with God. Now, again, this is a very it almost sounds austere the way the Rambam is describing the asceticism and the withdrawal from the social world that a person needs to achieve in order to achieve prophecy. There is a steep price to pay. And I think everyone can relate to this, is that at some point in our lives, we become fed up with the prattle and the meaningless conversation at a kiddush or at a cocktail party. And we basically say, this is not helpful to me as a human being. I am not being enhanced by the level of conversation that I find myself partaking in, whether it's in the back of the shul or whether it's at a social event. And certainly that would be true for a person wishing to receive true conjunction with God, which is which is our objective here. And then he says, when a person has achieved this level of receiving an overflow from his intellect into his imagination faculty, quote, this individual will only apprehend divine and most extraordinary matters, will only commune. I skipped a couple of words here, sorry, and will only commune with God and his angels, and will only be aware and achieve knowledge of matters that constitute true opinions. So such a person will achieve some level of prophecy, will see only God, is the word I left out, and his angels, and will only be aware and achieve knowledge of matters that constitute true opinions. And then that's where the Rambam launches into the three things that we opened up in our outline, the three things that you need in order to achieve prophecy: perfected intellect or rational faculty, a God-given endowment of healthy imagination, and finally, the pursuit of moral virtues. And then the Rambam says, every bodily faculty can become tired and weakened. This is how he ends the chapter. The same is true with the imagination faculty. Because it's part of the body, just like a muscle can become fatigued, something that exists in my brain can also become fatigued. And if I don't give it its proper rest and I don't exercise it properly, it will wear out. And therefore, the Rambam says this is why prophecy ceases to visit a prophet when he becomes sad or angry or lethargic or depressed. Our sages thus say that she'ein hashchina shora lo mitoch atzvut velo mitoch atzlut, etc., etc., that the divine presence cannot rest upon a person when he is in a state of sadness or a state of lethargy or a state of just silliness and so forth and so on. And the Talmud quotes proof of this by citing the prophet Elisha. When he wanted to have a prophecy in the second book of Kings, chapter 3, he said, I need to get in the mood of prophecy. He said, therefore, ve'ata kechuli minagain, ve'haya kinagain haminagain, v'tihi alav yad Hashem. He said, call a minstrel to play music for me, so that will put me in the right mood in order to be able to prophesy. Very consistent with what the Rambam said above and in his Shmona Prakim, that in order for a person to settle his mind, sometimes the aesthetic pleasing idea of sensory hearing or seeing will actually enable him to have an enhanced imagination and an enhanced intellectual faculty. We know this also from Yaakov Avinu, who ceased to have prophecy during the years that he thought that Yosef was dead. He was in a state of depression. This is also true of Moses' prophecy after the sin of the spies, even though, as we've mentioned and we'll mention in a later chapter, that Moses' prophecy was of a completely different category, and that we'll talk about that in a future chapter. And then he says, this is why prophecy ceased when we went into exile. And this is the very last thing that I want to end with today, that the Rambam's thesis is that the reason why our sages tell us that when the temple was destroyed, really the first temple was destroyed and we were sent into exile, prophecy for the most part ceased, except for some few prophets who were alive during the first temple period, and therefore, even though the temple was destroyed, their prophecy held over during the Babylonian exile. Why is it that prophecy ceased when we went into exile? So the Rambam says it is perfectly for very natural reasons that are directly related to my definition of prophecy. There is no greater sadness or laziness that can befall a man than being a slave to the ignorant who commit great sins and who have the intellectual pursuits of an animal. And so when we went into exile and we were dominated by captor nations who had misplaced priorities and who were not themselves intellectually interested in connecting to the divine, did not try to morally perfect themselves, then we basically became like them, and that's why we ceased to prophesy. The Rambam basically says is that there's nothing magical about the existence of a temple per se that that enables a person to have prophecy, but rather it is the fact that since prophecy cannot rest on the sad or on the lethargic or the depressed, it ceased to exist when we went into exile, when all those mental conditions were predominant. And it seems from what the Rambam says that theoretically, if a person were able to sort of rise above all of that malaise of being in the diaspora, a person would be able to achieve prophecy. And then he quotes 3 verses from scripture that describe how exile causes the human mind to deteriorate and causes, like it says in Eicha, that when we went into exile, lo matzu chazon me Hashem, we could no longer find a vision from God. Now, the Rambam attributes loss of prophecy in exile to the unsettling of the intellectual faculties. And I just wanted to contrast that for a moment with something that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writes in the Kuzari. And he says, and we won't have time to read it inside today, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's thesis is that prophecy can only exist within the land of Israel so long as the divine presence is resting there. Because instead of the Rambam's working definition that prophecy is an intellectual overflow coming from the active intellect into any human being that so desires to perfect his intellect and receive that overflow, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi instead understands that prophecy is a more supernatural phenomenon that is not based on intellectual perfection at all, but rather with a conjunction with the divine presence that exists in this world at certain times and at certain places. And therefore, it is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's contention that with the destruction of the temple, there is a cessation of prophecy per force, not having to do with the unsettled nature of the mind, because it's got nothing to do with the intellect whatsoever, but rather because human beings are now too detached from the divine matter or the divinity that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi consistently discusses throughout Sefer Kuzari. He compares it to you can have a perfect sapling, let's say a perfect vine that produces excellent grapes, but it needs to be planted in a soil that is propitious for growing that fruit. If you take a pedigree, a perfect, really, really very, very groomed pedigree of plant, and you plant it in soil which does not have the proper nutrients, no matter how beautiful and perfect that pedigree is of that sapling, the fruit will not grow properly. And that's because it wasn't placed in the proper habitat. Eretz Yisrael, when the temple is standing, is the only habitat where a person can prophesy. And that, of course, creates questions for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi having to do with, what about the fact that there were people who prophesied outside of Eretz Yisrael, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not going to go into that today. But I just wanted to leave you with that last little snippet at the end of the chapter. If you want to be able to pursue that differentiation between the Rambam and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, it's in the Kuzari, essay number 2, paragraph 14. You can read a lot more about it in other places as well in the Kuzari. Anyway, I think we've spoken enough for today. We basically get the gist of what the Rambam's view of prophecy and how it works. It's purely an intellectual process where a person, through their perfected intellect, through work in the acquisition of wisdom, will receive an overflow from God through the active intellect that will spill over into his imagination faculty if he is born with a good one. And together with moral development of the individual and development of his character, that person will achieve prophecy. Okay, of course, with the caveat from chapter 32, only if God so desires it and so wills it. I hope that's been helpful for you for today. We're going to now conclude our shir. I wish you all a wonderful day and a good rest of the week. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll see you next time, next week. Take care now.